The Unsolved Files.
On the night of March 31st, 1922, in the quiet countryside of Bavaria, a crime took place that would go on to become one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in history. Hidden deep in the rural landscape, about 70 kilometers north of Munich, stood an isolated farm known as Hinterkaifeck. It was remote, quiet, and cut off from the world. Exactly the kind of place where help would never arrive in time. By the end of that night, 6 people living there would be brutally murdered. But what truly makes this case unforgettable is not just the violence, it's the chilling evidence that the killer may have stayed behind, living in the house among the dead. The victims were all members of the same household. Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer, lived there with his wife Cecilia Gruber, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 young children, Cecilia and Joseph. On the very day of the murders, a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had arrived to begin work. She had been on the farm for less than 24 hours. All 6 would be found dead. In the days leading up to the murders, strange and unsettling events began to unfold. Andreas Gruber discovered footprints in the snow leading from the nearby forest straight to the farmhouse, but there were no tracks leading away. It was as if someone had arrived and never left. Around the same time, a key to the house went missing, and a newspaper appeared that no one in the family had purchased. At night, they began hearing footsteps in the attic. When Andreas went to investigate, he found nothing. Their previous maid had already left the job, claiming the house was haunted. At the time, it sounded like superstition. In hindsight, it feels like a warning. On the evening of March 31st, something or someone set a deadly plan in motion. One by one, members of the family were lured into the barn. There, in the darkness, they were struck down with a mattock, a heavy farming tool. Andreas and his wife were killed first, followed by their daughter Victoria. Then came 7-year-old Cecilia. Evidence later revealed that the child did not die immediately. She survived for hours after the attack, lying in the straw, pulling out her own hair in shock and pain. Inside the house, the violence continued. Maria Baumgartner was murdered in her bed, and 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his cot. The brutality was absolute. No one survived. Yet the most terrifying part of this story begins after the murders were over. The killer did not flee. Instead, evidence showed that someone remained at the farm for at least 3 days. The animals were fed regularly. Meals were prepared and eaten in the kitchen. Smoke was seen rising from the chimney. Bread was consumed and meat was cut from storage. It was as if life on the farm continued, except the family was dead. This detail transforms the case from horrific to deeply unsettling. It suggests not panic, but patience. Not chaos, but control. The bodies were not discovered until April 4th, 4 days later. Concerned neighbors noticed that the family had missed church and that young Cecilia had not attended school. When they finally entered the property, they uncovered a grim scene. 4 bodies lay in the barn, partially covered with hay, while the maid and the toddler were found inside the house. Unfortunately, the crime scene was quickly contaminated. Curious onlookers walked through the property, touched objects, and even used the kitchen. Valuable evidence was lost before investigators could properly examine it. The murder weapon, a blood-stained mattock, was later discovered hidden in the attic. The investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately fruitless. One of the main suspects was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had a relationship with Victoria and may have been the father of her son, Joseph. His behavior after discovering the bodies raised suspicion, particularly when he entered the house alone, despite the possibility that the killer was still inside. Another theory involved Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, who had supposedly died during World War I, although his body was never definitively identified. Other suspects included farmhands, drifters, and even a possible serial killer later linked by some researchers to similar crimes. Still, none of these theories could be proven. Despite years of investigation, multiple interrogations, and even modern forensic reviews decades later, no one was ever convicted. The case was officially closed in 1955. In 2007, a team re-examined the evidence using modern techniques and reportedly identified a prime suspect, but the name was never made public, out of respect for the suspect's surviving family. Today, the farm itself no longer exists. It was demolished just a year after the murders, as if to erase the horror that took place there. A small memorial now marks the spot, but the mystery remains. The Hinterkaifeck murders continue to haunt people, not just because of their brutality, but because of the unanswered questions. Someone walked into that farmhouse. Someone lived there, unnoticed. Someone carried out unimaginable violence, and then stayed behind as if nothing had happened. And more than a century later, we still don't know who.